We got more people in the waiting room. Awesome, awesome. I know y'all all signed up for this lecture. Perfect.
We can wait a few minutes if people need time to get in the room.
Heard you. Yeah. Get their note-taking devices. Waiting room. Awesome, awesome. I know y'all all signed up for this lecture. I need to pause that. because I also need to share it on the page.
Yeah, no problem.
Jasmine, Vincent says that they have some SAT stuff going on right now and that they won't be able to make the lecture.
Got it. Thank you. It'll be recorded, so he can definitely jump back on. Or listen to it after. Where? I know that updated.
Hey, Jasmine, a couple of the BCC team members are not here right now. They're on their way back to the house as we speak. So not all of us are here, but they're on their way back. They should be here like 3 minutes from now.
Got it. Thank you. That should be about when I'm done talking, introducing things. And they've heard that spiel. Everyone's heard my spiel, that I do at the beginning. So they're not missing. I mean, of course they're missing out. But they're not missing anything they haven't seen. Okay. Putting the link. Edit post.
And is that Zoom the only one that has multiple people on it? Okay.
That's the only one that has multiple people.
Cool.
Save. And now I'm going to start. BCC is just too cool for the rest of us. Can't relate to that level of coolness factor. Come on, computer. There we go. Okay, so share to a group. We'll be getting started very soon, y'all. Me talking to the folks watching the stream. How's it going? It's me again, Debate Boutique again. Hope that y'all are all doing well. Super excited for this lecture. Come on. Why does it want to give me a hard time? Okay, try this again. Oh my goodness gracious. Technology and it wins 10 times out of 10. Share to a group. Done. Boom, and post. Okay. Going to do the intro and talk, and then we'll be good to go. All righty, everybody. Hello. Welcome back to another Debate Boutique workshop lecture. Super excited for this one. This was a very much so requested and signed up for a lecture because we either you love the K or you hate the critique. It's here. So you're going to have to engage it from either one side. of the IO, or both if you are somebody who is more flex and wants to incorporate critiques in your strategy. So I'm super excited for Sarah Lee here to be leading that, and very smart person. We got a lot of the credentials on the bio and in the post that you clicked on to link on that, but the most, mentionable one is because, PhD or whatever, is a PhD student for Emory or at Emory, or what university am I messing up on?
I'm a Emory alum. I'm getting my PhD at DePaul.
At DePaul, okay, at DePaul. And so I'm super excited that she reached out to give this and has been sharing ideas for how to teach debating the critique. And I know that this will be very helpful, not only to our students, and our students, please ask questions, interact with this lecture, because it is intended for you, not for me, not for Sarah. We're no longer debating, right? So this is meant to help and boost your skills, your knowledge of the arguments. And to the folks who are watching, for those who cannot, attend programs, summer programs, this summer, this is also a resource for you, not only now, but during the school year, if you wanted to come back to this as a resource and guide for how to engage the critique. And so with all of that being said, I'm going to give the mic to Sarah to lead this lecture, and it's going to be really, really great. Oh, and if you are watching, I don't know why I always forget this, hit the subscribe button. Literally, it's right there, subscribe. And we got a lot of great things happening on August 15th. So y'all watch out for that, because debate critique is a vibe all year round, not just the summer. All right, now I'm going to make you the host and give you full creative control on teaching this lecture.
Great. Thank you so much, Jasmine, for your kind introduction and for setting the stage for this. I'm really excited to be here speaking with you all. Like Jasmine said, I don't debate anymore, obviously, but when I was in high school, I remember I had a lot of things that I wish that I knew. Now, as a PhD student in philosophy, having graduated with my bachelor's from Emory, and as a PhD student now, that I know now that I wish I could have told myself back then. So that's kind of the guiding force for this workshop and what I am hoping to impart on all of you. Like Jasmine said, I am a PhD student, so I'm very involved with academia, with academic literature, et cetera. So that's the majority of what we will be talking about, among other things. But before I get into sharing the presentation, this is where I can actually see all your boxes. So I want to ask you all, based on who's here, I've read your diagnostics, but I want to know, I know this can be a tough question to ask or to answer, but I'd like to know if you consider yourself a majority policy debater, a majority K debater, or a flex debater. And so if you consider yourself a policy debater, please go ahead and use the clap reaction. So that's this one. If you consider yourself a K debater, you can use this thumbs up. And then if you consider yourself more flex, you can use this heart. And so again, I know it's not always easy to answer, but just give me a sense of where you're at. Okay, cool. Thank you, everyone. Looks like we've got a lot of people who, looks half and half actually, people who consider themselves more K and people who consider themselves pretty flex. So that's great. That's exactly who this lecture is supposed to be geared towards. So I'm excited to talk with you all. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So 1 minute. And could you just give me a thumbs up if you can see this? Okay, perfect. So this workshop is called Debating the K, AF and NEG, because of course we are going to be talking about engaging the K more robustly, whether that be on the affirmative or the negative side. My alternative title for this is Taking a Step Back, Critical Reading and Research Skills. And that's because these are really the foundational skills, reading and research, that you're going to want to have in order to build that strong foundation to effectively debate the K in round. And so what I mean by taking a step back is, I know that for a lot of debaters, we're very focused on getting ready for the next tournament or getting ready for the next round, making sure you have answers to a particular argument, or making sure you have your 1NC prepped, or making sure you know what to say in response to this particular card. And getting ready for a specific team. And that's all super necessary and obviously central to what we do as debaters. But I know you're getting a lot of that already from your coaches and from the other consultants here at the boutique. So today we're going to take a step back from some of that, take a bit of a breather from those immediate concerns that we're always being haunted by in debate. And I want us to think about, again, building that strong foundation. So when you go in to do those things, building a 1NC, coming up with a strategy, cutting new cards in response to that really good team you want to beat at the next tournament, you have the basics to do that well. So taking a step back is going to be the theme for what we're doing today. And that being said, some of the objectives towards that end are going to be, number one, I want folks to cultivate a greater awareness of how to manage the actual learning process and improving your argumentation. So it means you're taking a step back to look at, how is it that you're actually doing the learning, and kind of metacognitively considering what it is that you're doing to learn your arguments. The second thing is, of course, you're going to be developing these critical thinking and research skills, among other things, in order to deepen your engagement. And finally, I want basically to give you a set of tools to understand challenging material. So we all know K literature can be a little bit difficult sometimes. I mean, a lot of evidence and debate can be, but I think K-Lit in particular has a set of conventions and trends that make it particularly confusing and challenging. So those are some of the things that when you run into something that you don't really understand, whether that be in your own argument or in something someone else is reading, you'll have a set of skills and tools to look towards to solve those problems for yourself, even beyond this workshop and even beyond the debate boutique. So again, towards that end, what we will do today is to give you a bit of a roadmap. We're going to be discussing the added value of learning to read academic theory effectively. Again, that's the focus of today. We're going to consider the learning process. I'm going to model for you a close reading of debate evidence. So we're actually going to go through in practice and see what it is that you can do when you run into something challenging in order to more effectively understand it. We're going to review the intellectual genealogy of some concepts in the philosophical literature, and we'll talk more about what genealogy means in a second. And finally, we're going to look at those tools and resources. Now, what we're not going to do today is, like I said, we're not going through answers to specific critiques. You're getting a lot of practice with that with other folks, so that's not what we're doing. We're not going through the entire history of the philosophical literature. That would be impossible. And nobody can do that even in their entire lifetime, let alone in one workshop. So part of what I want to impart on you all is that there's going to be a lot that you don't understand, and that's okay. We're not going to try to know everything there is to know. And finally, what we're not doing is we're not discussing K-Lit that's not academic in nature. There is a lot of K-literature that isn't academic in nature, whether that's blog posts or articles written by journalists or activists or artists, and those are all totally legitimate and important to learn how to read. But again, we can't do everything. So today we're focusing on academic literature in particular, because I think this is what people struggle the most with. So finally, I'm going to have some orange slides in this presentation. If you're here with me in the Zoom, these orange slides indicate that I'll be asking a question and I'm asking for a response. So I'd love for you to participate. You can go ahead and use the chat function, which should be at the bottom of your screen, or you can feel free to speak out loud, whichever you're comfortable with, I'm totally fine with. But those orange slides are going to indicate that it's time for some audience interaction. Okay, great. Any questions at this point? Okay, great. So I want to start by talking about this added value. So why bother? Why even build these skills in the first place? And the answer is pretty detailed, because these critical reading skills, critical research skills, some of you might already be seeing this in what you're doing here, but they can help with everything from cutting and explaining cards in round, answering questions in cross-ex, asking questions in cross-ex to set up arguments for yourself, indicting your opponent's cards, defending your own cards. And I think one thing that bears some explanation is knowing which cards that are not worth cutting. So oftentimes, honestly, I see people reading cards that are not getting them very far in the debate. They're not very strategically useful for them. Typically, these are cards that don't have a lot of meat on their bones. So they're rhetorically powerful in a lot of cases, but they're not really setting up the arguments with the kind of strong warrants that you ideally are looking for. So learning how to read effectively is going to give you that discernment to determine like what is worth my time in the first place and what isn't. You know, what is something I read and I just kind of keep in the back of my mind, but I'm not going to cut that and read it in an actual round. So these are some of the skills that this foundation that we're building today is going to help you get to. To be a little bit more specific to the in-round, I wanted to speak a little bit about what tends to frustrate judges sometimes about debates. And in particular, I've heard this a lot about from class judges in K debates. So some of the things that you can always do that will make your debates better is, first of all, being more specific over general. So making particular claims over sweeping ones. Nuance over repetition. So as the debate goes on, you want to be fleshing out arguments in greater detail, not repeating buzzwords and saying the same things in the same way. Now, some of this sounds kind of obvious when I say it out loud like this, because in a lot of ways, like it is. But in a lot of ways, I think people have these ingrained habits where they are being too general or too repetitive in round. And I think what it is folks don't always know what it is that they're doing and how to resolve that. So that's what we're talking about today. And finally, of course, you want to create clash. So you want to actually make arguments that are applicable to what is being said in the round by your opponent. And you've probably heard this, you want to avoid having two ships passing in the night. And the better you can do this, the more compelling you'll be in the speeches you're giving. So all this to say is that with good basics, you're going to have endless options. When you have that strong foundation, you know what your literature says, you know even what the other team's literature says, and you know how to take that, you'll be able to more effectively navigate and maneuver yourself in a round based on what your opponent is saying. Of course, we make strategic decisions about what choices are going to get us further in a particular round. You want to be adapting. So this is going to help you do that. So no matter what you're hit with, whether it's an argument you've hit hundreds of times or it's the first time you've ever seen it, you'll be able to more effectively orient yourself in round because you're empowered to. You have that foundation to make those decisions with strong judgment. So my question for you, again, taking a step back and looking at what you actually do when you're in the research process, I want to ask, when you are in the process of researching, you're reading articles, you're cutting cards, you're reading books, you're in the library, OCRing some pages, if folks are still doing that. I want to ask, what do you actually do when you run into something that you don't understand? So you read it and you're like, I'm so confused. This makes no sense to me. I'm kind of stuck here. What do you do? And so I'm really curious to hear, what practices are you engaging in? For example, like, are you marking up the text in a specific way? Are you asking someone for help? Are you just skipping it and moving on and doing something else? I see some notes in the chat, and I think someone's raising their hand. So Luke, go ahead.
For me, if there's something I'm reading, like an article, and I want to cut it for card, and there's something I don't really understand, if I could ask someone for help, I would do that, like say a coach, or maybe if I don't have a coach, I would do external research, like search up things that are related to what I don't understand, so that I can get a better understanding.
Great. Thank you for sharing. It looks like, it sounds like the two things you mentioned are that you ask for help from someone who you feel confident knows what they're talking about, or you're doing your own research in some way. And I see in the chat that other folks say the same thing, that they're asking someone more knowledgeable who knows about the topic. These are all great tools to have in your toolbox. And it's great that you guys feel comfortable asking folks for help. The other thing, that we just talked about is external research. So, these are all tools that you have to solve the problem of ignorance, right? So what we're really focusing on here today is, what if, your coach doesn't know, or you don't have a coach, or you want more information than what your coach can provide, just due to time constraints? Well, you can do some work on your own to make sure that you are getting where you need to go. And that's what we're talking about today. So when you're learning an argument, again, looking at your learning process, I think of this in 4 steps, 4 stages, and this is not linear. Let me be clear. In fact, it should not be linear. You should be constantly cycling through these steps 2 to 4, typically over and over again, after debate rounds as you learn more about what you're doing. So the first stage of learning an argument or relearning an argument is you're like, what is this? I don't even know what this is. That's basically the stage where maybe your coach says, okay, today we're talking about the state's counterplan, or today we're talking about topicality. So this is usually a novice year when you don't know a lot about debate and you're just getting really very surface level titles about what you're talking about, but you have no knowledge or information about what that argument is or how it works. Number 2, which you should go very quickly into, is you're gaining familiarity with concepts. So for example, if your coach says we're going to talk about the state's counterplan today, you're going to start learning about, the difference between federal and state jurisdiction. You're going to start learning about the possibility of states coordinating on a particular policy. You're probably going to learn some counterplan theory. And you'll probably talk about how fiat works in this case, because all 50 states, all 50 entities are doing a particular policy. You're going to talk about what that means. So here you're getting kind of the building blocks for making the argument, but it's kind of like school where you're kind of intaking information from a lecture, or you're reading a textbook or something, and you're just getting kind of a list of information down. That's how I think of it. And you're putting the system together for yourself. Number 3, which is really key to debate, is you're realizing the implications of those concepts and of the arguments that you're expected to make. So here is where you're going to start thinking, if I was the other team and I was reading the state's, and I was hitting someone who's reading the state's counterplan, what would I say in response? So this is where you'd start considering, how do I answer a solvency deficit that someone makes? Or how do I answer this theory violation? Or how do I talk about conditionality in a way that makes sense? And it isn't going to lose me the round. So this is where usually the debate jargon tends to come in as well. And what I find sometimes is, I think for students, they, especially at the stage where you're going from novice JV or JV to varsity, there's a lot of points where you're getting the jargon introduced to you, you're trying to learn it, which is great. But then sometimes students lean a little bit too much on the jargon, not just in like the way they're explaining the argument, but also the way they're understanding it in their heads. So you are not getting beyond the surface because you're relying on the jargon to make the argument for you, even to yourself. So I think recognizing that is really the first step to getting that deeper understanding that we're trying to get. So we don't want that surface level buzzword tagline understanding. We want to get deeper into what we're doing. And finally, stage 4 is deployment. That's when you actually make the argument in the round. So stages 2 and 3 are going to be the guiding stars for today's workshop. We're going to intervene here in order to improve your understanding of the arguments that you're reading and the arguments that you're hitting. And the thing I want to emphasize is that stages 1, 2, and 3, all 3 of these stages are before the actual tournament. So you want to, in the ideal world, to the extent that you can, do all this prep in advance. It takes time to understand difficult material. And if you can get this down before the pre-round, it'll make your pre-round time usage more efficient because you won't have to get those building blocks down. You'll already have that coming in, and you can work on spin. You can work on honing in the argument. You can work on crafting a specific answer to the team that you're about to hit based on what they've read at the tournament. So I really can't overstate that before the tournament is really where the bulk of this preparation happens, and it separates the best debaters from the good debaters. So to speak a little bit towards some of the things that we want to resolve, I've written a list of what students tend to do in between tournaments and what I think they should be doing. So students tend to write blocks and forget about them. They just keep reading the same blocks over and over. What you want to do is you want to constantly revisit your blocks as you're doing more research and reading. What you understand about your critique in October is going to be pretty different than what you think you understood in August in the preseason. So you want to make sure you're revising that and setting yourself up for success early on in the round. People will lose rounds and then they'll do minor tweaking to the language of blocks. What you want to do is you want to lose the round and use that opportunity to reread or read your evidence. So that means not just the cut portions, but everything. You want to read the context. You want to read the entire article. If you're reading from a book, you want to ideally at least skim the introduction of the book, because that is going to give you a sense of what the author is trying to accomplish and what they're attentive to. And finally, students tend to look for rhetoric in cards, which is fine. I mean, we want rhetoric to some degree, but you want to look for evidence with strong warrants, and you also want to look for evidence that has consistent claims. So what this means is that you want the different pieces that you're reading in your critique, the different cards you're reading, to be living in the same intellectual space, as in the authors that you're reading should be generally ideologically consistent with each other, obviously, but also that intellectually they're kind of speaking from the same school of thought to the degree that is possible, and they're attentive again to the same kinds of concerns. So sometimes cards will sound really good, but then you read the article and the context reveals that the author is not really concerned with what it is that the argument that you're trying to make, or even jiving very well with the rest of your case. So you want to be airtight. You don't want any opportunities for people to poke holes in the spaces between the cards that you're reading. All right. So I want to ask you all, when, I know we just talked about the importance of reading and rereading to the best of your ability. So I want to know, what strategies are you employing when you read? As in, again, do you just read straight through? Do you get a card from your coach and you just read the underlined portions? Do you circle things, underline things? Do you listen to it in audio form? Tell me a little bit about what that looks like in practice. Okay, so Benjamin says that they are highlighting and annotating. That's great. Neon says, I kind of just read straight through, but it doesn't work for me since it goes in one ear, but goes out the other. Yeah, I completely understand that. I definitely felt like that a lot when I was in high school as well. So this is really where active reading and critical reading is going to help you with that. It's going to help it go in one ear and stay in your head and help you digest it. Okay, Cindy says, I tend to read the whole thing if it's short and then highlight. Okay, great. So I'm going to help you kind of like hold on to those concepts that feel like they're running away from you, or they're kind of like disappearing into thin air. The first thing I'm going to talk about, and this is really the core here, if you can do this well, this is going to serve you for the rest of your life, or at least the rest of your life as a student, and especially as a debater. So I'm going to talk about something called genealogy. Genealogy, defined by the dictionary, is just a line of descent traced continuously from an ancestor. So when you are talking about genealogy, typically as a layperson, you're talking about genealogy in the context of family structure. So you've probably seen those family trees where you have one node, this is the person you start with, and then you see their parents, then you see the parents' parents, your grandparents, all the cousins, siblings, etc. And it branches upwards. And the farther you go up, the more history that you really learn about the initial node that you're talking about. So a genealogy is a way to go from one part of that family tree to the next. When we look at your great grandparents and follow their descendants, we eventually get to you. When we're talking about philosophy or theory writ large, genealogy refers to the kind of intellectual heritage that the thinker has. So what does this mean? It means that your thinkers are always in dialogue with other thinkers, whether that be contemporarily or whether that be people who come before them. A lot of your thinkers are enmeshed in this really big context of folks who are speaking, 100 years before, the 200 centuries, millennia, even millennia before them. And they're thinking through this in a really robust way that's coming through in the particular text that you are reading. So what you want to ask yourself is, who is your thinker responding to? So not just what do you think this has to do with today? Of course, you do need to think about that. But also, who is it that they want to answer effectively, whether that be an agreement or disagreement, whether they're saying, I agree with this person, I love what they say, here's how I would update that, or whether they're saying, this person was so wrong, and here's how I explain why they're wrong, and here's how I solve the problem of them being wrong. So on that note, what is important to remember is what an argument is just as important as what is not. And what getting to what an argument is not is going to, again, get you that deeper understanding that you're not just doing tagline explanation. You're going to realize, again, the context and the history of what folks are saying. So I want to show you a picture that I think illustrates this pretty well. So this is a graphic that shows the history of, this should say Western philosophy, the canon of Western philosophy. So it starts with ancient philosophy, and it goes through these lines of descent where you see the ancients and the pre-Socratics. Those are just the people who came before alongside Socrates. Going into the sophists, you've got Socrates and Plato here. And you see all these lines, and what this indicates in this graph is that these people are somehow building on the folks who came before them. This is the Renaissance. And these dotted lines indicate that these folks are disagreeing with the people who came before them. So even though they're in the same genealogy, again, they're in disagreement. This one, so here's where it gets really important for debate is you've got the German idealists, Kant, Hegel, Schopenhauer, among others, and then the existentialists, the phenomenologists, and the pragmatists as well. And then this graph shows that eventually this gets into contemporary philosophy, which they're calling political philosophy. I would also include the philosophy of race here, post-structuralism, post-analytic. So I'm not showing you this because you need to know every single thing on that graph. I'm showing it to you just to give you a sense of how big the context you're reading into is. You're not really just reading Wilderson. You're not just reading Christina Sharp. You're reading typically everyone from Plato up until the person in question. So what you want to ask yourself again, another way to put this is, who is your intellectual mother? Who is it that is indebted to? Who is it that Heidegger is indebted to? Who Nietzsche is indebted to, etc. Okay, so I'm going to do some examples of genealogy to give you a sense of what that looks like. But like I said, the ethos of this is I want to get back to basics and I want you to have a strong foundation. So we're going to start with some words that I'm sure all of you have encountered many times already and have had explained to you. So I'm going to go through definitions pretty quickly just to make sure we are all working from the same place. But what I'm also going to do is I'm going to give you the central questions that thinkers who are working with these concepts are usually thinking through. So what does this mean? Okay, so I'm going to tell you the things that really launched and made possible these branches of philosophy in the first place. And the reason I'm going to do that is because when you get stuck on big words in K literature or long sentences, or you just don't know what's going on, it's always helpful to think back to what are the central questions of the article, of the thinker's concern. And usually it typically does fall into these categories at least a little bit. So this is going to help you when you get stuck. This is where you need to go back to. And if I were you, I would write these down on a Post-it note and just stick it to my laptop. So when you get overwhelmed, confused, frustrated, just look back at your Post-it note and retrace your steps. So epistemology is the study of knowledge production, it's the study of knowledge. In debate, sometimes it's taught as the study of knowledge production. This can be a part of epistemology, obviously. The study of knowledge can include that of production, but it's broader than that. So it's the study of knowledge. It can be about production. It can be about other things, such as what is truth? What is knowledge? What is the value of knowledge? What does it mean to speak truth in public? What is ignorance and why does it matter? So these are all some of the big picture things that thinkers are working through. Again, sounds basic, but gets a lot more complex, as you can probably see just through your research. Ontology is the study of being. So what is being? What is reality? What does it mean to become? What things exist and what things don't exist? And finally, there's metaphysics. So metaphysics is a word that, like many of these words, can be used in many, many different ways. So like the quote says, it's not easy to say what metaphysics is. And again, the reason for this is like people are using these terms in different ways. And that's just part of the game of figuring out what it is that your thinker is talking about. So for metaphysics, typically, It can be used to capture both concepts of epistemology and ontology, and sometimes the relationship between the two. I've also seen it just used interchangeably with the word ontology. So again, it just depends on who you're reading and how they're using the word. The takeaway here is to be flexible about your understanding of these concepts. So I've given you definitions and questions, but typically they don't really have stable definitions. It's pretty fluid. You want to understand, though, what is the author herself trying to do internal to her own work? So if you read one person and then you read someone else and it feels like they're using the word ontology in different ways, that's totally fine. And honestly, they probably are if you're getting that sense. What you want to do, though, is figure out what that particular person means by ontology. And what's going to help you is to see who is that person responding to? How's that person they're responding to using the word ontology? So I want to give a bit of an example of this when it comes to metaphysics and where you'll probably see this word in debate itself. So you've got, usually when I see this word come up in debate, it's usually either associated with Heidegger, so literally the Heidegger K, or it's Ks that have thinkers who are indebted to the Heideggerian tradition, whether they significantly agree or disagree, but they are, again, in that genealogy. So that includes some identity Ks, some parts of Afro-pessimism, especially those that are indebted to Calvin Warren. And for this topic in particular, it's going to be eco-managerialism. So whether they're citing Heidegger or not, frequently they are drawing from Heidegger scholars in making their arguments. Of course, they're not all typically, they're really never wholesale agreeing with Heidegger, given that he was a Nazi and that a lot of that does infuse his philosophy. But I think some of these thinkers are appropriating what he says for their own ends, which tend to be leftist and radical in different ways. So usually this is, again, where I'm seeing this word metaphysics either from Heidegger or from, again, these types of critiques in debate. The thing about this is that Heidegger's, what you're probably seeing is that you're seeing probably something of a critique of metaphysics, or Heidegger's critique of metaphysics, or Heidegger's solution to Western metaphysics, something like this. And the thing to remember is that Heidegger is really making a very specific kind of argument. So he is disagreeing with the ancients, which here is really Aristotle and Plato and how they're conceiving of metaphysics. So when you see Heidegger's critique of metaphysics, that's really shorthand for something more closer to Heidegger's critique of the Western tradition of metaphysics, starting with Plato and Aristotle. And that's because Heidegger's whole thing was that he was saying, you know, his philosophy is going to overcome all of the problems he saw with Western philosophy, starting with Plato, through Aristotle, through Kant, up to him. He's greater than this entire lineage. So to him, he's overcoming the genealogy, in his mind at least. But nonetheless, he is indebted to these people. So, you know, his point is really that he feels that, in short, quick and dirty, is that he feels that the metaphysics that has been espoused by Platonism is too universalizing, it's too transcendental, it's too separated from the immediate reality of embodied experience in the world. It's too above our heads, it's something that is beyond rather than immediate to our everyday experience of thrownness. So what you really want to see here is when you see a phrase like the critique of metaphysics, or Heidegger's critique of metaphysics, is it's really specifically a critique of Platonism. And the reason this matters is that metaphysics can be used kind of in two different ways. So number one is when it comes to Heidegger, it can be used in a narrow and specific way, meaning his critique of a kind of metaphysics that came from Plato. But the other way that this word gets used, whether that be by Heidegger scholars or in the other literature, is a broader conception of metaphysics, which is simply to say that which comes before the physics, something that explains how the world works beyond one's immediate perception. So and this may have to do with Plato, it may not, just depending on what it is that the person is saying. And so you want to keep this in your back pocket as you're reading, that sometimes these thinkers, number one, are using shorthand to refer to a very particular lineage of thought. But if you see that word again somewhere else, it really might just mean something else. So that's metaphysics number one and metaphysics number two. I know that's a bit of a lengthy example, so I want to get into something that is a little briefer and has maybe some greater familiarity. I know there's quite a bit of interest here with race theory and Afro-pessimism in particular, so I'm sure many of you are familiar with the concept of social death. This is really a seminal concept for Wilderson, picked up by other Afro-pessimists in various ways. But the genealogy of this is that Wilderson is really taking this from a sociologist named Orlando Patterson, wrote this book in 1982. For Patterson, and many of you likely know this already, but he was writing about sociology of slavery and Blackness. So this is social death for him is when social presence exists without full personhood, and when slaves are alienated from collective sense making. In other words, they're not of the same kind of collective world that that structures of whiteness create. Patterson in particular was writing about slavery, but of course Wilderson is picking up on this in a way to talk about a structural position. And this is actually a disagreement between the two. So again, Wilderson is in the genealogy of Patterson, but he's updating him in a very significant way that is at the end different than what Patterson intended to say, and Patterson has actually come out and said this as well. But nonetheless, Wilderson's contribution was extremely important. It spawned, so many different thinkers who were thinking about Blackness and anti-Blackness in significant ways. We're thinking about civil society and constitutive exclusion. So this is really a very simple genealogy of how a concept gets updated throughout time between 1982 to 2010 between two thinkers who have different things they're thinking about. But the other thing I want to point out is social death is not a concept limited to what thinkers of the Black tradition are writing in. So there was Derrida, who was writing probably the first, at least white person in the European canon to talk about social death was Derrida, who writes about this extensively in various different ways. Contemporarily, there's Lisa Gunther, who writes about solitary confinement and social death in prisons. There's Lauren Berlant, who writes about the kinds of slow death that haunt life under capitalism, and she calls this a kind of social death as well and uses that terminology. And again, these people are writing about this in a way that's different than Wilderson, is not necessarily indebted to Patterson. And so when you're seeing these words social death, you want to be mindful about what their lineage is. What Wilderson is saying is not the same place Lisa Gunther and Lauren Berlant are coming from. So all this to say that concepts have lives far beyond what we can immediately see. And you want to keep this in mind, because it's going to keep you from getting too stuck in one understanding of what you're reading. I think what would benefit everyone, and this is what they teach oftentimes in philosophy classes, is you want to come with a sense of humility to the text. You don't want to assume you know everything about what is being said, even when you're familiar with some of the terminology. So how do we do this? How do we actually employ humility in a way that is actionable and practical? Well, I'm going to get into some strategies with you all. I know that you all shared some things you guys are already doing, which is great. Thank you for that. And I'm going to help you add to this toolkit of things that you're doing. So I'm going to share these with you, and then I'm actually going to do it on my screen, and then you can kind of see how I go about it. So number one is you want to make sure to highlight key concepts. So this could be, as obvious as if you're reading an author who's known for a concept or has it in their title, this is a key concept. So if you're reading Christina Sharp, you better make sure you understand that the wake is a key concept, the hull, what she's doing with the image of the ship. This is extremely important. But when it comes to other situations, it might not be so clear. If you don't have much of an understanding of the lineage yet, you're not always going to know what the key concepts are. So for example, that might include, and this is going to be in the example I show you, but the concept of dialectic is really important in a lot of the thinkers that are being read in this particular tradition with Wilderson coming from Fanon, and we'll get into all of that. Dialectic might be something you've heard of, it might not be, but it is certainly something you should highlight if you see it in a lot of cases. So we'll get into how to identify some things that might feel a little bit more hidden, less obvious. Number two is you want to highlight transitional and descriptive phrases. So this includes things like phrases that indicate that the author is about to disagree with someone. So that might say, in contrast with, or in disagreement with, or in contradistinction with. This typically indicates you're about to get a break from someone. So A says this, but your author is saying this person is wrong. I'm saying this other thing, or this other person is saying this other thing. You might see phrases like in parallel with or in alignment with. This indicates agreement. And other times you'll just see words like and or but, and this will also indicate whether you're seeing a pivot or a consistency. But usually involves a pivot. You're moving in a different direction, and usually is the opposite. It's an extension. This is really important. You want to look for citations. So when you are reading a text that is academic, that's usually going to be in a footnote or in a parenthetical. It'll have usually a last name and then a year or a page number. So these are super easy things to find, and they're really, really helpful for identifying genealogy. So if you see this, you want to make sure you're always getting these. Number 4 is you want to read for context. Like I said, you want to read the entirety of what you're reading, or if you don't have time, I know it's not always practical to literally read every single thing. You want to at least read the abstract for a journal article, because that's going to tell you where the article starts and where it ends, where the person is going, what they're attentive to. But if this is your 1AC or your 1NC, you really should be reading the entire article of the cards that you're reading. Number 5 is you want to go line by line in the evidence. So you're not going to understand everything, but you want to make sure not to skim. There are cards that skimming is fine for. I think politics disads, uniqueness cards, people skim all the time. And that's usually enough, honestly, for debate. When it comes to K literature, I don't think you can skim in a lot of cases. You're just going to miss too many details, because these thinkers are usually using words that seem simple and have one definition for lay people, but they're using them in ways that are very different in their text. So you want to make sure you're picking up on that, or your argument is not going to get below the surface level. And finally, this is really overlooked, but you want to look at titles. You want to look at, like I said, in the wake, obviously that's an obvious one, but you can look at titles if you're hitting a team, read the titles of all their cards, and that'll give you a sense of the intellectual heritage they're writing from. So this is a lot, and I'm gonna show you how to do this now. But before we get into it, so I'm gonna basically show you a Wilderson card in a second, and we're gonna go through it. But I want to do one more example of genealogy, and then we're basically gonna put all of this together. So the concept of genealogy with these like actionable skills. And I want to ask you all about your familiarity with someone named Frantz Fanon. So on a scale from 1 to 5, please put in the chat. I don't think anyone has their cameras on, but you can put in the chat. 1, you've never heard of him. You don't even know who this is. Number 5, you've read him in depth. Number 3, like maybe you've read some secondary literature. Okay. Great, so we're getting a few 1s, a 3, a couple 2s. That's great. That's great. 5, okay, Lillian says they've read 1 book of his. That's great. Another 2. Okay, great. So that's a good place to be, because it means a lot of you have this opportunity to learn something really exciting. Frantz Fanon is one of the most important thinkers in the Black critical race and decolonial tradition. If you were reading anything in those schools of thought, you were probably reading someone who's read a lot of Fanon. In particular, when it comes to debate, Fanon is associated with 2 schools of thought. There's Afro-pessimism, Wilderson, who's doing a particular kind of reading of Fanon, and then there's something called Black existentialism, which has a different reading of Fanon, in short. And so if you've ever read or seen cards by Lewis Gordon, in particular, he is basically the foremost expert on Black existentialism in the United States right now. And he actually writes a lot about Afro-pessimism and how his reading of Fanon is different than how Wilderson is reading him, basically. So there's this internal disagreement even among Fanon scholars about what really key things in his text mean. And again, you want to be sure you're understanding not just that you're reading in one tradition versus another, but you want to understand the line, right? You want to understand like how it is that these things are differentiated from each other. But at the very least, being able to sort in these categories will help you. Let's say someone's relying on a strategy with Lewis Gordon and you're reading Afro-pessimism. Now you have a jumping off point to do research into Black existentialism, to do research into Lewis Gordon and understand where he's coming from and how to answer that. Vice versa as well. So we're going to try it. I'm going to show you this card. So this card is a card cut and read by Rutgers in the preceding season. And so this is a K that they read against Northwestern at the Northwestern tournament. They have this card, which is by Wilderson, and then the next card, which is by, we say this wrong, Agathan Gallo. But we're not going to have time to get to this today. I think we're just going to focus on the Wilderson stuff, but I'm going to show you something with the card that's pretty useful. So can I just get a thumbs up, like you can see what I'm showing you? It should be cards, not the presentation. Okay, I'm getting a few thumbs up. All right, great. So we will get into this. So the first thing you want to do, this is a card that I took from a team. So I'm trying to understand a card that another team cut. So I want to make everything the same size because we're reading for context. If you're in the debate round, you probably read the highlighted and you know what the underline says, but you haven't read the rest most likely. So you're after the round, prepping for the next tournament, or maybe you're prepping for this team for the next tournament. Either way, you want to do this. Okay, now you can see everything the same way. Apologies for the formatting. Google Docs kind of messed it up, but you can see the highlighting they did. We've made larger the citation. So now we can see, okay, let's say I've read the tag already, and I see this is by Wilderson. All right, great. And it says the title of this is The Prison Slave is Hegemony's, parentheses, Silent Scandal. And this was presented at a conference. All right, cool. So when you see this title, The Prison Slave as Hegemony's Scandal, I think what I'm going to do here is I'm going to highlight the word hegemony. I know this is going to be about hegemony. I know this is going to be about the slave. And if you've read any Afro-pessimism or Wilderson, you know this is central for Wilderson. So you can highlight this. Hegemony is typically a really important concept when debaters are reading it. So that's how you kind of know, okay, this is a key concept for me. So I'm going to highlight that orange. Okay, so now I'm going to actually start reading the card. Civil society is not a terrain intended for the Black subject. So if you've read any Wilderson at all, you know civil society is a really key concept. If you went to the Afro-pessimism talk a couple days ago, you know that as well. So civil society is not a terrain intended for the Black subject. The Black subject is also, you likely know, something that Wilderson is centering. And finally, this is really important and often overlooked. You want to highlight and mark copula. So copula are usually like being verbs. It's going to be is, are, were, was, etc. You get the point. So it's basically a word that connects the subject to the predicate, meaning it's going to tell you like what is the thing, what is the equivalence that Wilderson is making. So here it's actually a negation. So it's kind of the opposite. It's saying is not. So you can highlight this. I'm going to do it in purple. So copula are in purple here. And I'm going to bold not because I need to remember this is a negation. Okay, philosophy is all about negations and equivalences. So if you can get what the alignment and the disagreements are with, you're going to be in a great place. Okay, it is coded and waged, and wages are white. So again, if you know Wilderson, you know this concept of white wages is important. Even if you don't know Wilderson, if you've read like other kinds of Black thought, like you've read Du Bois, for example, you're going to know these concepts are pretty key in the tradition. Okay, civil society is the terrain where hegemony is produced, contested, mapped. So I see this word terrain again. So he's saying on one hand, this is not for the Black subject, but it is for hegemony. All right. When I see a list like this, what I'll usually do, it's a lot to hold in your head. I'll usually mark the first word on the first read through, and then I'll go back later and I'll think about each word. But just for now, I'm just going to hold produced in my head, because if I have to hold all three, I will start losing concepts. I don't think your brain can hold that many concepts at the same time and understand them. So next sentence, and the invitation to participate. So and, that's a transitional phrase, like I mentioned. So you want to mark this. I'm going to go with, let's do red. So and the invitation to participate in hegemony's gestures of influence, leadership, and consent is not extended to the unwaged. So you're going to highlight this again with copula, and it's not, so it's a negation, to the unwaged. So already you've got a few concepts floating around. If you've read Wilderson before, this is probably pretty basic to you, but if you haven't, then this is a great way to get started. You've got civil society, you've got the concept of those who are waged and unwaged, and you've got the concept of hegemony. So hegemony and unwaged, those don't go together for Wilderson. We live in the world, but exist outside of civil society. The structurally impossible position is a paradox. Okay, so here, again, if you know Wilderson, you know the structural position is a key concept, but what I'm actually gonna highlight here is impossible. And this is kind of interesting because the question of possibility is I think one of those hidden things where it's latent in a lot of the evidence. And if you're reading K's and other teams are reading things like political pragmatism against you, the question of possibility is very important. So I'm going to highlight this because I know that, because I know what people tend to do in debate. It's a paradox because the Black subject, comma, the slave. So I'm going to highlight the slave here. It was in the title, that's pretty important, but also because it's modifying the Black subject. So again, this is another equivalence that Wilderson, the Black subject and the slave, is, I like that. So another equivalence. So he's really packing a lot into like 5-6 words. You already have like 3 equivalences here. Is vital to political economy. Highlight the colon because he's going to elaborate on this. She kickstarts capital. Okay, so here you see this word capital. I'm going to highlight this orange. And when you see the word capital, you should think to yourself, we're probably talking about Marx or someone related to Marx. We're talking about Marx or Marxism. A lot of you probably know this intuitively because you've seen it a lot in the context of Marx. But you want to think, okay, this is probably Marx. Keep that in your head. At its genesis and rescues it from overaccumulation, from its overaccumulation crisis at its end. Also, this is also a Marxian concept. But, which is a transition, is then red. So you're going to get a pivot here. Marxism. So I was right. It is about Marx. That's what he's about to get into. So he alludes to Marx before he gets into Marx. So you know that all of this is going to be somehow connected with what he's going to say next. Whatever this pivot is, he's going one direction here about the Black subject, and he's going somewhere else with Marx. But Marxism has no account of this phenomenal birth and life-saving role played by the Black subject. Okay, so here you can see there's a negativity to what he's saying about Marxism. It doesn't have an account. This is really important what the slave does, but Marx doesn't get it. That's what Wilderson is saying. So I'm just gonna mark this for myself because it's giving me an indication of where I'm going. Colon, mark this as well. I know it seems tedious, but when you first start doing this, it's gonna really help you when you go back to the text because you'll see where all the shifts in the text are. From Marx and Gramsci, we have consistent silence. So he's indicting both of them. And what I'm going to do, because this is so easy, you see Marx and Gramsci, he's calling people out by name. I would highlight this yellow because this is a genealogy he's building out. And he's told you by name who is in the genealogy. So this is super, super easy. There's silence. So he's saying kind of the same thing. He doesn't say anything about this. Okay, so here's where we get some more complex syntax with Wilderson. It's a long sentence. This is probably where your brain starts to doze off. He says, in taking Foucault to task. So when you read this, don't read more, read that. Okay, in taking Foucault to task. So first you see Foucault, this is easy. So mark this as yellow. He's calling out another person by name, meaning he's building out another genealogy associated with Marx and Gramsci. So in taking Foucault to task, this is a prepositional, this is a preposition and this is a clause, but anyway, it's another descriptive phrase is what I'm trying to say. What this means is you want to ask yourself, in taking to task, who is taking Foucault to task? You just read it, it's Marx and Gramsci. So he's saying something about Marx and Gramsci's reading. Okay, he's not saying something about his reading as Wilderson. He's talking about Marx. So I would highlight this in taking Foucault to task. And what did I do for transitions? I did red. So I'll do red here. I like this again, yellow. And then this is associated with Marx and Gramsci. If you're on your computer, you can't draw lines, but I would maybe just underline for now. You can get rid of it later if it's not relevant to the card you're cutting. But in taking Foucault to task for assuming a universal subject. Okay, so when it says in taking him to task, he's saying that Marx and Gramsci are criticizing Foucault. They disagree. So this is another disagreement. It's a dotted line for assuming a universal subject. So they're like, Foucault doesn't get this. He thought there's a universal subject, but probably there is not, is where this is going. So the universal subject, obviously also a key concept in revolt against discipline. That's just like what Foucault is writing about. In the same spirit, okay, so here's another descriptive phrase that you need to note. In the same spirit in which I have taken Gramsci to task. So highlight this, in the same spirit. So this indicates there's going to be an alignment, and it's going to have to do with him, I have taken Gramsci to task for assuming a universal subject. So what is he really saying here? He's saying that even though Marx and Gramsci were setting up an argument about who Foucault is wrong to assume a universal subject, he also is pointing out that Marx and Gramsci have also assumed a universal subject. So he's kind of like giving them a little bit of flack, right? Like he's like, you said this is a problem, but your philosophy has failed on the metric of its own. You set this up and you're still getting it wrong. So he's being a little shady. Okay, so we've read like half the sentence, but we can see where the moves are. The subject of civil society in revolt against capital, Joy James writes, okay, so he's saying in the same spirit in which okay, skip the rest, Joy James. This means that he and Joy James are in alignment. Oh, I just got rid of, oh, here we go. And then I did that yellow, okay. So this is pretty important because Joy James is going to tell you something about what Wilderson thinks. There's a colon here, I would mark that, and then there's elaboration. So I'm going to skip this for now for the sake of time, but again, if you're reading this, you should be reading all of it. And then you've got this, this parenthetical, which tells you the text that Joy James is writing in, so you want to make sure to highlight that as well, super easy. Okay, says more about Gramsci, about white people. This is all very important, but I'm skipping it for now because I think it's clear that it's important, especially for Rutgers. You can see that they highlighted it. There's a lot of wording here that indicates a resonance with psychoanalysis and decolonial theory. And you see here, it's Fanon. So you want to highlight that. Again, you should actually read this, but for the sake of time, I'm skipping it. So Fanon, you see Fanon cited again, super important. You see Sexton cited, see parentheses, it's super easy. Fanon again. And you see this is a concept by Fanon, if you're familiar with him. Okay, so I'm skipping this. It's all really important, but I'm skipping because I want to show you something. So I'm going to start here. It says Black liberation, which Rutgers has highlighted, as a prospect makes radicalism more dangerous to the US. Let's talk about Black liberation, also a key concept. Not because it raises the specter of some alternative polity. So this is a disagreement, disalignment, but because it's condition of possibility. Okay, so you see this word possibility again, and I said that was important earlier, right? So it is important. He's talking about possibility and impossibility. So what I would do here is I'm going to mark this, and I know someone said they annotate. That's great. And I'm going to show you a way of annotating. Why is there no line? Okay, comments. So impossibility and possibility. All right, so you're working with this distinction. And the other thing I should have showed you here is when you're seeing these disalignments like Marx and Gramsci he's disagreeing with, I would annotate this like this. So I would do something like disagreement, Marx and Gramsci. Okay, but Joy James, he agrees with. Joy James. Okay. And this is going to help you when you go back to the text. For example, if you're, people read Cap a lot against Afro-pessimism. Well, he's got a built-in critique to Marx already here. So this is going to help you build your warrants for when you're doing your answers to Cap. Okay. So going back here, its condition of possibility as well as its gesture of resistance. And I'm going to highlight this as well. Functions as a negative dialectic. Okay, this is what I wanted to get to. So negative dialectic, a politics of refusal and a refusal to affirm, program of complete disorder, one must embrace its disorder. So I'm going to highlight these. And I'm going to tell you why I just highlighted those. So when it comes to resistance, this is such an interesting card to me because it actually has really good built-in warrants against the kind of cards that policy teams will tend to read against this argument. So you're going to see a lot of cards that are like, cede the political, alt fails, apolitical, alt doesn't do anything, whatever. You've probably seen these before. But Wilderson is kind of interesting here that he's actually using a lot of the language that a lot of the pragmatists that policy teams are going to try to read against you. So he's already using the language, he's already thinking about that to some degree. And it's rhetorically powerful, but it's rhetorically powerful because he's responding to that genealogy that that your opponents are going to be reading. Okay, I highlighted refusal. This is mostly because I know this is important because it's Wilderson. And the more Wilderson you read, you're going to realize that if this is an argument you want to read. And then disorder. So this is, I think, because you see a refusal to affirm. This is pretty important for debate. But this is a modifying clause where he says a program of complete disorder. So what is he saying? It's in refusing affirmation, you're getting disorder. So I'm highlighting this because he's telling you what it is. It's the equivalence. Okay. There's a lot more here, but I'm going to stop here and zoom in on this concept of negative dialectic because this is extremely important. And I'm going to show you how to actually build out the genealogy on your own if you don't know anything, which is totally fine. Debate, you're here to learn. So negative dialectic, I know this is a key concept. I know it because I study philosophy and I know dialectic is important, but let's say you don't know that. Now you do because I just told you, but let's say you didn't know that. Okay, so this is the genealogy you want to get to. I'm going to show it to you first. So you've got Wilderson and you've got Fanon. You know, pretend you can't see Hegel, Sartre, Adorno yet. So you've got Wilderson and you've got Fanon. You know these are important. Wilderson because you're reading him. Fanon, you know, is important. Number one, because you've seen him cited multiple times. I also just told you Fanon is really important in this tradition, but also because if you look at this next card they're reading, it's called Fanon on Decolonization and Revolution. Oh, okay, Fanon's really important still. This is where they're going with it. Bodies and dialectics. Okay, great, dialectics. You see the dialectics is mentioned here, and you know this article is going to be about dialectics. So this is extremely important for, at least for the way that Rutgers is reading this card. It might not be maybe for another team, but it is for Rutgers. See this dialectics. Okay, go back. So now you're like, all right, this is super important. I need to remember this. Okay, now I need to craft my genealogy. So you've got Wilderson, you've got Fanon. All right, now I'm stuck. I don't know what to do. So negative dialectic, you know, dialectic is a thing. What's a negative dialectic? I know someone said they do their own research. I'm guessing some of that just means like Googling. Googling can be really helpful. You don't want to stop there, but Googling can be really helpful. So you can just Google, it's kind of funny, but just Google negative dialectic, okay? And this is gonna help you for debate. So the first thing you see is, oh my God, it's actually a book that's written by Theodore Adorno. And then you have Google was so nice to give you a kind of a definition that Adorno is coming up with. And then you've got even a Wikipedia page on it. I'm going to say use Wikipedia cautiously because it's not always super accurate, but I think it's enough for what we're doing right now, which is just building the genealogy. So, okay, go into this. It's talking about the book by Adorno. So you want to remember, okay, they're talking about different things because Adorno is not getting cited here, but he's still using this phrase. All right, so I'm reading this. It says he wants to update the dialectic. That's a genealogy. Blah, 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 all this stuff. Okay, Hegel. So you know Hegel is going to be really important. So I'm going to write Hegel here. I already did that. And you know this is going to be in the genealogy. You might also just know that dialectic is associated with Hegel, in which case you can skip skip this step for the most part. It's still going to be helpful for you to Google it, but you already have that. There's also Plato, which is blue texted here. That's fine. You can include that if you would like, although it's not going to be useful for us in this case. And then I would just read this. They don't always have the best summaries, but it's worthwhile sometimes to read it. I've read this and this is pretty good. Okay. So now you've got Plato, Hegel, no Sartre though, Fanon, Adorno, Wilderson. Oh my God, you have so many people in the dialogue or in the genealogy. Sartre is important, but for this, you don't need it. Okay, so I'm actually going to take this out. I know it's important again because I study this, but you don't. My point is you don't need every single thing in order to have enough to be successful at understanding what you're doing. So you've got Plato, Hegel, Fanon, Adorno, Wilderson. All right. What you want to do here is you want to, so what you want, I'm going to tell you this, and then I'm going to tell you how to do this on your own. So I'm going to tell you right now that this is a key concept for Hegel. If you see dialectic, it's always going to be a response, almost always going to be a response to something about Hegel, something Hegel said, something that came out of Hegel. So you want to keep that in mind. Hegel had this sense of how human ethics works, how interactions between human beings works. I'm going to keep this quick and dirty. It's going to be real quick. But I'm going to summarize really quickly what he's trying to do. So for Hegel, you might be familiar with this. He calls this the master-slave dialectic or the lordship bondage, depending on your translation. It's really more like, for us, something like a servant rather than a slave, which has a different historical and racialized context for us. And it's just not a great translation. But for the slave and the master, both are vying for recognition from each other in the dialectic. So this is the interaction that happens between everyone, is what he's saying. So even when there's a hierarchy of power for Hegel, the master and the slave both seek recognition from each other. The slave, of course, seeks recognition in that he wants to be a good servant. Like he wants to do a good job. He wants the master to recognize that. He doesn't want to maybe lose his job. Again, we're talking about servants, not slaves in what we're talking about. So take Wilderson out of your mind for a second. So he's looking for recognition. Another example might be like if you have an employer and an employee, the employee wants recognition from his or her boss that he did a good job, or she is going to get a promotion, whatever it is. That recognition is needed for you to move up and be a good employee. It's central to your identity. But he also says the master is actually seeking recognition from the servant. And the reason is because if the servant does not mutually recognize the master as a master, the master loses his power. This is what Hegel says. So the master is only able to tell the servant what to do if the servant identifies his or herself as a servant. And in doing so, we have the particular relationship of power, but the servant could theoretically spit in the master's face and walk away. The servant could beat the master up. The servant could say, "You're not my master anymore. I'm finding a new master," or I'm not even a servant anymore. I'm getting another job. So that recognition is really the linchpin to the relationship that's happening there. It makes possible the type of situation that the two are in. Okay, I'm going to leave it at that. I know it's abstract, but I'm going to leave it at that. It's going to get more clear in a second. So Fanon is going to update this and say, Fanon is writing from this the perspective of the colonized Black subject. That's what he's centering. And he's saying, all right, Hegel, you were wrong, because there are situations where human beings do not have that relationship with each other. And that is in the case of colonization. And for the Black subject, there is no recognition that there's no recognition that the white man seeks from the Black man. Because for Fanon, the Black man is in, you've probably heard this, the zone of non-being, that the Black man does not get recognition from the white man. He exists outside of the kind of world that the white man resides in. And so there is no possibility of that relationship. There's no ethical possibility because of that exteriority. That constitutive exclusion has made it such that the white man does not need the Black man's recognition in order to exist as a white man. In fact, it is white supremacy that comes and merges with certain myths and ideologies that make whiteness possible, but it is not the recognition of the Black man that makes that possible. Okay, And that's quick and dirty, quick and dirty. Adorno, I'm going to skip for now, but Wilderson, it's really interesting here what he's saying, because for Fanon, dialectic stands still. So for Hegel, it's really important that the dialectic continues to move. When the two recognize each other, you get something greater, which is the relationship between the two. For Fanon, dialectic stands still, meaning it freezes. There's nowhere to go. There's no ethical possibility because there is no movement between the two. But what's really unique about this card is that Wilderson actually seems to be suggesting there is possibility and there is a kind of movement, but it's not the kind of movement that Hegel means because it's negative. And so if you read that Wikipedia article, it tells you that the negative dialectic for Adorno is called that because he disagrees with the affirmative character of the dialectic for Hegel. So let's say you just don't even know what that means. That's fine. But you know, okay, Hegel affirmative, Adorno negative. And Wilderson is borrowing this language. And he's definitely read Adorno at some point, even if he's not citing him. And even, I'm not saying they're saying the same thing. I'm definitely not saying that, but it's giving you hints as to how to understand this. So you've got the negative dialectic. For Adorno, this is about the opposite of what Hegel wanted, which is to get into the transcendental. It's to get into higher order principles that are greater than the sum of its parts. So for Hegel, unity is bigger than the pieces, right? Okay, so that being said, for Adorno, it's the other way around, that the whole is not necessarily greater than the parts. Maybe the parts are greater than the whole. That's the question, right? So he's going downwards. Hegel goes upwards, higher level. You want something bigger. Adorno is going downwards. Wilderson seems to suggest something similar here, which is interesting. That refusal for him is that movement downwards. And in some way, when you think about disorder, it's something about breaking up those categories that have made possible the kinds of syntheses, the kinds of higher order principles that reify whiteness. So anyway, the point of all this is to say that once you've come up with this genealogy and you understand that, you will have such an easy time writing a really robust defense of your alternative. And when teams start saying you're ceding the political, your alt fails, whatever, you have all of your answers built out for you. Because honestly, a lot of those cards that policy teams are reading are typically pretty generic, and you have a very actually particular answer to this. It's a specific kind of method that Wilderson is endorsing here. Okay, that's all I'm going to say about that for now. But I want to tell you one more thing, because I know I just explained the history of this for you, but if you wanted to find this out on your own, you know this now, but if this was a different concept and you didn't know this, okay, what you want to do is you've built this out. You have Wilderson, Adorno, Fanon, Hegel, and Plato. Plato is usually like, sometimes it's important, sometimes it's not, but Hegel is really the key for the dialectic. And if you do a few Google searches with each of their names, you're going to see that if you didn't know that, but now you do. So the other thing you want to do is, Fanon is super important. Hegel is super important. Adorno is like a little bit less important. It helps you, but it's not as important for the actual genealogy. So Fanon, what I'm going to do is I'm going to Google Fanon and Hegel. Cool. And then you see the first thing that's suggested is Hegel and Fanon on recognition, which I just talked about, and Fanon and Hegel recognition turned on its head, which again, I just talked about. This is going to help you. Google is not always trustworthy, but this is such a common concept that I guess the first result is pretty helpful, actually. It's an EDU page, first of all, so it's not written by like a rando, at least. And then I've read this. This is pretty accurate as well. So this is going to teach you about what I just explained. You could also read this academic article if you've got the time, and if dialectic is key to what your card is about, I would recommend doing that. This is going to be super helpful. Even just reading the abstract, super helpful. Skipping around, all this is going to be super helpful, and it's going to teach you what I just said without me having to be there. Of course, if you do have someone to explain it, even better, but if you don't, this is the way to do it. Okay, I'm going to leave it there. Obviously, there's a lot you could do, but I think I've tried my best to give you the building blocks of how to do this on your own, and we're going to try it today. So some core takeaways is, number one, of course, I hope you realize the importance of close critical reading and research. You might already be realizing that on your own. Number two is, we've talked about genealogy, its use and its function is what you should take away. And three is actionable strategies for reading and research when you don't know what you're doing. What these things are actually going to help you with in terms of debate is it's going to help you explain your research more effectively in round. It's going to help you adapt to your opponent's arguments. And I think this is the most exciting part, is it's going to help you innovate new directions for your own research. When you understand the literature, you're going to know where it's going, and it's going to help you know where you're going. Thank you. Last thing I want to ask you to do is I want to ask, what is your takeaway? What action step will you take to improve your pre-tournament research prep? So I'd like for everybody to please in the chat, go ahead and type up what action step you're going to do. So this should be something you're not already doing in terms of your preparation. So I would write something like, I am going to blank in order to accomplish blank. And if you want to say more about why you're doing that, that's totally, that is encouraged. I'll give you guys a few minutes to work on that. Okay, so Benjamin says they're going to revisit blocks after rounds to update them. And Neon says they're going to dip their toes into more lit bases to understand the concepts of Ks. Cindy says, I'll start looking at the genealogy of the evidence to get a more robust understanding. Great, these are great takeaways. Okay, that's all I got in terms of the lecture. I do have an activity where you're actually going to practice this, but we can open for some questions if anyone has them. Feel free to chat them or raise your hand.
Before they do that, Sarah, can you give me back hosting so I can end the live
Oh,
stream?
yes, for sure.
And then, sorry, I just want to